play the game of Quixx, first, set up the game. To do this, first set out the dice. The game is played with 6 dice. 2 of the dice are white, and the other 4 are different colors. 1 red, 1 blue, 1 yellow, and 1 green. If you don't have an exact copy of the game, you can use your own colored dice, or color the sides of plain white dice with a permanent marker to match the colors for the game. Next, give each player a score sheet and a writing utensil. If you don't have the actual game, you can find printable score sheets on the Board Simple website to try out the game. After setting up the game, players are ready to begin playing. The game of Quixx is a quick, strategic dice rolling game. The game can be played with 2 to 5 players. Players are trying to score the most points by crossing off dice values on their score sheets. The trick is, after they cross out a value, they can't cross off any values to the left on that row, so they must use strategy to avoid blocking themselves. To start the game, one player will be named the start player. That player will take all 6 of the dice and roll them at the same time. After rolling, they will complete the 2 steps of their turn. The first step of a player's turn is a step that all players can choose to participate in. The active player will look at the 2 white dice from their roll. They will add the total of those 2 dice. So this total would be 4. They will announce the total of the dice out loud. Now all players in the game may choose any one space that contains that number in any one row. The one thing players must keep in mind is that after they mark a row, they can no longer mark any space to the left of that space. So if this player chose to mark off this space, they would only have a few spaces left in this row. Players are trying to mark off as many values on their score sheet as they can, so this would not be the best value to mark. If they chose to mark off this space instead, they would still have all of these spaces remaining. As mentioned, all players in the game are able to participate in this step, and they are able to mark 1 open space on their score sheet. No player in the game, including the player who rolled, has to mark a value on their score sheet. This step is optional for all players in the game. After all players have decided whether or not to mark the value on their score sheet, the active player who rolled the dice will move into step 2 of their turn. The second step of a player's turn involves just the player who rolled the dice. That player can choose 1 white die that they rolled and any 1 colored die that they rolled and add them together. So if this player chose this red die with a value of 4 and this white die with a value of 1, they would add them together to get 5. They would score in the row that matched the color of the die they chose. So this player would be able to score their 5 from the red row. They may only score that value if they have not yet crossed off that number in that row. They may also not score the value if it is to the left of a box they have already crossed off. They must always mark boxes from left to right. It should also be noted that a player can't decide to score their dice from step 2 before they score their dice from step 1. Step 1 must always be completed before step 2. On a player's turn, during their 2 steps, they can mark up to 2 boxes on their score sheet. However, they do not have to mark any if they choose not to. As the game moves on, they may reach a point where they are unable to mark any boxes. If this occurs, the player will receive a penalty. Penalties will be explained further later. After a player finishes the 2 steps of their turn, the next player will take their turn. Let's look at an example of a turn. The player rolls all 6 dice at the same time. They will take the first step of their turn and add the total of both of the white dice. The total for this roll is 11. They will announce the total out loud. Now all players in the game may mark any 1 open space on their score sheet that contains that number. This player decides to mark this space on their score sheet. Now they are no longer able to score any value to the left of that space. Now they move into step 2, which is a step that only they take. They can choose 1 of the white dice and 1 dice of any color, and score for that color. So this player could score 11 or 12 using these dice for their red row. They could score 6 using these dice, or 7 using these dice for their yellow row. They could score 8 for their green row, but they could not score 9 because they have already scored their 9 for green. They could not score anything for blue using this roll because they have already scored their 11, and the 12 is to the left of their 11, so it cannot be scored. This player doesn't have to mark anything, but this player decides to mark their green 8 using these 2 dice. After taking their 2 steps, their turn is over. If the player who rolled the dice chooses not to score any dice during their turn, they will receive a penalty at the end of their turn. Each penalty will lose them 5 points at the end of the game. Let's look at an example. Let's say this player rolled this. They will add the total of their 2 white dice, which is 7. The player who rolled doesn't have any 7 available to mark, so they will not mark anything on their score sheet for the white dice. They will now move into step 2 of their turn and choose one colored die to add to one of their white die. This player can't score their 4 or their 5 for the red row. They can't score their 6 or their 7 on their yellow row. They can't score their 9 or their 10 on their green row, and they can't score their 8 or their 9 on their blue row. There is no combination of their dice that they are able to use to score on their score sheet. Therefore, at the end of their turn, after completing their 2 steps, this player must take a penalty. They will mark their penalties on this section of their score sheet. Each turn a player takes, where they either choose not to score, or they can't score at least 1 die during their turn using the dice they rolled, they will gain 1 penalty. Each penalty they gain will lose them 5 points at the end of the game. It should be noted that the only player who can take a penalty is the player who actually rolled the dice. So the other players in the game will not take penalties for deciding not to score when it is not their turn. There is one special action that can occur during the game. This is known as locking a row. Locking a row is connected to crossing out the last number at the far right end of a row. To be able to cross out the last number in a row, a player must have at least 5 marks in that row. If they don't have at least 5 marks, they can't cross off the last value in the row, and they can't lock the row. If a player does have at least 5 marks on a row of their score sheet, and they roll the value in the far right box of that row, that player can use those dice to lock the row. They can lock the row during step 1 using the value on the 2 white dice, or during step 2 using 1 matching color die and 1 white die. To lock the row, the player will cross out the last value in the row. Then, they will cross out the lock symbol on that row. Finally, they will remove the die that corresponds to the color of the locked row from the game. All players will now roll 1 less die during their turn. They will also no longer be able to cross off any value from the locked color. The player who rolled the dice is not the only player who can lock a row. As mentioned during step 1, all players have the option to mark off the number corresponding to the total of the 2 white dice. For example, let's say this player called out 12 during step 1 of their turn. Their blue and green 12s are no longer available to mark. They also do not yet have at least 5 marks on their score sheet for their red or their yellow, so they cannot score any value during step 1 of their turn. This other player, however, does have at least 5 marks on their yellow row. In fact, they have 7 marks. They decide to mark this 12 on their yellow row. They have now locked the yellow row by marking off the last value of the row. They will mark the lock symbol on this row to show this, and immediately remove the yellow die from the game. Now no other player in the game may score for yellow for the rest of the game. It is possible for multiple colors to be locked by either 1 or more players during a single turn. The active player can lock 2 separate values during their turn by locking one during step 1 and the other during step 2 of their turn. It is also possible for 2 or more players to lock during step 1 of a player's turn. For example, during step 1, the value is 12. The player locks their red row. This player also locks their red row. Using these same dice, this player locks their yellow row. Several players can lock the same row or different rows at the same time. The game will continue with players taking turns rolling all 6 dice and completing the 2 steps of their turn until the end of the game is triggered. The game of Quixx ends immediately after at least one of the following conditions has been met. The first way the game can end is if a player reaches the maximum number of penalties. If the player who rolled the dice takes a penalty at the end of their turn, and it is their 4th penalty of the game ends immediately. The second way the game can end is if at least 2 dice in the game have been removed. It should be noted that it is possible for 3 dice to be removed from the game, if 2 colors are locked on the last turn. After the game ends, all players will complete their final scoring. To do this, first, each player will count up the number of marks that they were able to make on each row of their score sheet, and score each row. They will use the chart on the score sheet to figure out their score. The top number is for the number of marks, or X's made. The bottom number is the score. So this player had 8 marks on their red row, and would score 36 points. It should be noted that if a player marks off the lock symbol on their score sheet, this does count as a separate mark. The player will write that score in the corresponding box. They will do this for each row. So they had 4 marks in their yellow row, and would score 10 points. Their 3 marks in their green row would score them 6 points, and their 3 marks in their blue row would also score them 6 points. After scoring each row, each player will lose points for any penalties they took during the game. Each mark they made in the penalty section will lose them 5 points. This player had 2 penalties, for a total of 10 points. They will write that value in the penalty score box. Finally, they will figure out their final score. To do this, they will add the total of their 4 color row scores, and subtract the value of their penalties, as shown on the score sheet. This player's final score is 48 points. The player who ends the game with the highest score wins the game